transformative pathway to sustainably address food crisis. A commitment that grows continuously since jointly launching the Global Network Against Food Crisis in 2016. I'm also very happy to see the considerable interest this virtual event has raised. We have with us participants from permanent representations, the EU, UN sister agencies, as well as representatives from the private sector and civil society. 2021 has seen a particular momentum for anticipatory action on the international political agenda. Last month, a high-level event to advance anticipatory action and galvanize a collective push to act ahead of crisis was co-chaired by Germany, the UK, and the United Nations in New York. Anticipatory action also featured prominently in the discussions leading to the UN Food Systems Summit. In the framework of Action Track 5, Build Resilience to Vulnerabilities, Shocks and Stress, it was strongly highlighted that early warning systems and anticipatory action play a key role in monitoring and predicting multiple risks of disasters, crises, and conflicts. Protecting people from the impact of disasters rather than wait for the worst to happen is the guiding principle of anticipatory action that more and more agencies and governments around the world are now adopting. According to recent analysis, at least half of all humanitarian crises are foreseeable, and 20% of them are highly predictable. Empirical evidence built over the past years shows that for every $1 FAO invested in anticipatory action, vulnerable households have a return on investment ranging from $2.5 to $7.1 in avoided losses and added benefits. This high-level Brussels dialogue is an opportunity to share knowledge and to better understand the role that anticipatory action can play in preventing food crises, protecting livelihoods, and saving lives. Before giving the floor to our moderator, my dear colleague Dominique Burgeon, the director of the FAO Liaison Office in Geneva, I would like to invite you to watch this introductory video that was produced by the Anticipatory Hub. I thank you.
Extreme weather events are causing destruction more frequently and severely than ever before. Storms, floods, heat waves, diseases, and other types of hazards affect millions of people every year. Crises around the world are intersecting and compounding each other, increasing the risk of conflict, displacement, and hunger. The poorest and most vulnerable are hit hardest, adding to record levels of humanitarian needs in decades. By forecasting when hazards will strike, analyzing their risks, agreeing on actions, and enabling financing ahead of time, humanitarian organizations and communities can act before disasters hit. This way, anticipatory action saves lives and livelihoods and ultimately preserves people's self-sufficiency. It's a faster, more efficient, and more dignified way to protect people against predictable crisis. We want to shift the humanitarian system to be more proactive instead of reactive. But for anticipatory action to reach more people, cover more locations, address more types of hazards, and create lasting impacts in the lives of the most vulnerable, more can and must be done. But what will it take? First, when a crisis is imminent, every second counts. Because of that, we have to invest in early warning and readiness to anticipate, especially at the local level. Second, fast help also requires fast and pre-arranged funding. That is why we need to expand flexible, predictable, and coordinated financing. Third, different events in the world increase the risk of disasters. This reality calls for the application of anticipatory action to a wider range of hazards. Fourth, we must find the appropriate solutions for each challenge. This is only possible through exchange, collective learning, coordination, and partnerships all around the world. Fifth, For anticipatory action to become business as usual, it must become an integral part of national disaster management systems. These recommendations reflect our years of experience in more than 60 countries as the Anticipatory Action Task Force. We are formed by 5 organizations: IFRC, FAO, WFP, OCHA, and START Network. Collectively, we have put our resources and expertise into anticipatory action to save lives and livelihoods. The Anticipatory Action Task Force promotes a wider reach of anticipatory action, provides technical support, helps build evidence, and strengthens synergies with global initiatives to support countries. Together, we are calling on communities, organizations, and governments to join us so more people can benefit from anticipatory action. Let's make humanitarian assistance faster, more efficient, and dignified by acting early on predictable crises.
Welcome, Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dominique Durgeon. I am the Director of the FAO Liaison Office with the UN in Geneva and the Officer in charge of the FAO Office of Emergencies and Resilience. And I will be your moderator during today's event. As my colleague Rashad El-Khafraji said, we are facing today a complex new set of challenges which we collectively need to address. The severity and scale of food crisis today clearly demands new kinds of solutions. The purpose of this event today is to come together and make an important contribution to these solutions. Building on the outcomes of the high-level event on anticipatory action convened by the UN Secretary General last month, as well as the UN Food System Summit, we come here today to discuss a decisive shift in the way food crises and other humanitarian crises are addressed. As was clearly stated in those events, if we are to have any hope of reversing the current hunger and humanitarian trends, the world must go ahead and get ahead of the crisis curves. Today, we want to showcase the experience of key partners at country level, examine success factors and challenges, and highlight the role that anticipatory action can play in preventing food crises by curbing food security deterioration in countries subject to recurring food shocks. And we will provide an opportunity to express visions on how to scale up anticipatory action as key component of humanitarian and development efforts in the coming years. The high-level Brussels dialogue today is an opportunity for collective learning and exchanges, and I am delighted to have here today many distinguished speakers and panelists from partner organizations, government, and intergovernmental bodies that we will have the chance to interact with. But before starting, and even if by now you are all experts in virtual meetings, allow me to share some details regarding the logistics. You are invited to update your name and organization by clicking on the dots that appear in the right-hand corner of the box where your own personal video stream appears and selecting Rename. If you have any problem or technical issues, please send a message in the chat box to ask for support. There will be a Q&A session at the end of this event where there will be an opportunity to interact with panelists as well as with experts from our organizations. For that, we have enabled the Q&A feature of Zoom. Please use the Q&A module for questions, not the regular chat box. We will ensure to take into consideration as many of your questions as possible. Finally, this session is being recorded and will be available after the event. We will have a rich interaction for the next 2 hours and a half. So I would say fasten your seatbelt. The first part of our event we'll give the floor to our high-level speakers who will be sharing their perspective and contribution of their respective organization in moving towards preventative approaches to humanitarian disasters and in particular food crises. The second part of our event will give us the opportunity to learn from experience of key partners. First of all, our 6 representatives from different countries will be presenting their experience at field level to give us an overview of context where anticipatory action approaches are applied. Then we will engage with our panelists to discuss lessons learned, main challenges, and key success factors. This technical session will then be followed by the Q&A session and some key takeaways. So let me now introduce our distinguished speakers today. Today we are very pleased to have with us Dr. Chu Dongyu, Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization, Mr. Janish Lenarchic, European Commissioner for Crisis Management, and Mr. David Beasley, Executive Director of the World Food Programme. Dr. Stanislas Rašan, the Acting Minister for Development Cooperation and State Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Slovenia, and Mr. Martin Griffith, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinators, are not able to join us this morning, but will deliver their messages through video recording. Then, now, friends and colleagues, it is my distinct pleasure to invite Dr. Chu Dongyu, Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization, to speak. Director General, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dominic. Dear colleagues and friends, and especially greetings from Rome to my friend Janish, the European Commissioner, and David Beasley is my old friend, and then we are on the same boat to help the people who need the most. Dear colleagues and friends, I'm so happy to almost 300 participants now. So it's well organized. I congratulate the first event organized by Russia together with Dominic, after you are sitting in the new office. We live in one world full of numbers, but there is certain numbers that must stand out and demand our attention, because this number are the people, real people in behind. The SOFI 2021 report confirmed that up to 811 million people in the world faced hunger in 2020. More than 3 billion people cannot afford health debt. 41 million people who are at risk of falling into farming or farming-like conditions. The situation is daunting. Low productivity, climate crisis, COVID-19 pandemic, and conflict are among the major reasons. This trend are showing us that our traditional reactive approach no longer fit our new reality. All our organizations are working hard than ever, and our donors have been more generous than ever. Yet we are falling short. As before meeting, David Beasley remember all the numbers of money asked for filling this big gap. So we do differently. We need to work better. And better means more innovative, more proactive. We must be more efficient and effective. Dear colleagues, we need a transformation. And we have sound evidence that anticipatory action can be transformative. But it requires resourcing at scale to realize that potential. We need that many food crises are preventable because they are recurrently happening natural, especially natural disasters. It's recurrently happening. Every 1 year or 2 years, they have their own intervention. Every 5 years, they also repeat again. So we know that investing in early warning system pays off, not just for the community, but also for the government. For example, in East Africa last year, we knew that the locust world coming, and we took anticipatory action. Yeah, and Dominica, Lohan, and other colleagues in New York and in Geneva, in Europe, in Brussels, we really make much on to ask the donors to take immediate action to support this. I really appreciate the donors from the government, from civil society, and from other organizations. Yeah, and especially I think now I would say appreciate from the support from the European Union. They offer the tangible and concrete support to help us stop the upcoming or emerging crisis from the desert locusts. In close cooperation with the government and with the help of donors, including the European Union, we saved the farmers more than $1.5 billion in losses and to their crops and livestock. I think the European Union invested only 10%, no, 3%, sorry, yeah, of that. So it's really a big harvest from the small investment in anticipatory action. And we protected food security of more than 36 million people. We needed to invest in science and innovation, include data. We need more data driving decision making and the data driving business model. FAO is a champion of the innovation and the digital tools, such as Honey geospatial platform, which is essential to helping members achieve the sustainable development goals, address the future food crisis, a better future in which we can anticipate all the food crisis is achievable. But only if we work together and the best science and data, especially big data. Partnerships such as the one between FAO and the European Union are critical for the collective success in the averting future food crisis and transforming our agri-food systems. The global network against the food crisis is an excellent illustration of how the European Union and FAO, together with the key actors such as the World Food Programme and others, bring like-minded partners together to, in fact, real challenge by promoting sustainable solutions to food crisis. This includes a strong focus on the prevention and anticipation. We need to make anticipatory action that establish the practice in the humanitarian assistance systems. Protecting people against the growing threat is not only the responsibility of humanitarian actors, but also development actors. We need to help the government and the communities build an early warning system, early action into their strategies as a game-changing solution for food insecurity. Because only they put this on as part of their strategy and for long-term design and action plan, that's when we can end up that the challenges in the future, so that we can protect more people from the predictable crisis. Donors needed to know the make flexible fundings available to act on predictive data, make prudent fiscal sense for the resources constrained world. Dear colleagues, the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed that the fragility of our global agri-food systems and the need for radical transformation of this system if we are to feed 8.5 billion people by 2030. This is the core FAO New Strategy Framework 2022 to 2031, which focuses on the transformation to more inclusive, efficient, resilient, and sustainable agri-food systems for better production, better nutrition, a better environment, a better life for all, leaving no one behind. FAO mandate is empowered to take the leadership role for the implementation of the outcomes of the recently held UN Food System Summit. Last night, we just finished it is 9th anniversary committee for UN Food System Summit. And they asked FAO to take the leading role for implementation of the Food System Summit outcomes, to ensure that the ambitious outcome translated into urgent and concrete effort to transform agri-food system in the world. Last month, at the high-level pledging event in New York, FAO announced that together with our partners' contribution, we will significantly increase our overall emergency financials to anticipatory action by 2025. That the same day, I was encouraged by the commitments which followed from the diverse group of stakeholders. Let's continue to work together to anticipatory action needed to build a better future when no one is left behind. Thank you. Over to you, Dominic.
I thank you, Mr. Director General, for your intervention and for indeed highlighting the transformative power of anticipatory action and its criticality as we face the challenges of tomorrow in a future where, as you said, we must ensure a more resilient, inclusive, efficient, and sustainable agri-food system for all, and in particular for the most vulnerable. Thank you also for highlighting the commitment of FAO towards scaling up this approach and for underscoring the importance of partnership as well as of investing in innovation. I now wish to give the floor to Mr. Janish Lenarchic, European Commissioner for Crisis Management. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dominic. Dear colleagues, I'd like to thank the co-organizers, the FAO and WFP, for supporting this event. Earlier this year, I addressed the launch of the Global Report on Food Crisis. And on that occasion, we were already noting the worrying levels of hunger throughout the world. Millions of people are in need of emergency food assistance. Entire regions are at risk of famine for a variety of reasons, most easily anticipated and often preventable. The main problem remains that the food assistance needs are rising faster than the funding available, making the current aid paradigm unsustainable in the longer term. And the international community must urgently respond to this. We need to start acting on the risks of future food crises, providing support before the worst comes, and addressing the root causes of food insecurity. That's why we believe that anticipatory approach is a promising approach. We know that it saves lives and reduces humanitarian needs. It is time that we make it an integral part of the design of our food assistance programs and the delivery of our food aid. The European Union supports anticipatory approaches and preparedness in a variety of ways. For example, we have a dedicated budget line on disaster preparedness, and this year we have allocated 75 million euro. Our aim is to create flexible and reliable funding structures, which would be better suited for anticipatory action and famine prevention. As Dr. Chu mentioned, we have recently launched a new programmatic partnership with FAO. This multi-year and multi-country initiative will support anticipatory action in Southeast Asia in a first stage and will expand later to other regions. It will focus on food security, particularly in the most vulnerable areas of the region. Anticipatory action is also an important tool to address the impact of climate change. In Burundi, for instance, we are working with the World Food Programme to set up an anticipatory action scheme that can be activated ahead of climatic shocks. This system is working successfully against floods, and we want to make it also operational against droughts. We are also transferring capacities to the Burundi Red Cross so that it can be run locally in the near future. In Vietnam, Cambodia, and the Philippines, we are supporting our partners to scale up the anticipatory action mechanisms linked to shock-responsive social protection schemes. These are underpinned by an innovative use of climate risk information, helping farmers to protect their crops and livelihoods before typhoons, floods, or droughts strike. In Nigeria, we are supporting the developing of early warning tools for flood and drought hazards using advanced satellite imagery. This action will also collect data about the impact of conflict on agricultural livelihoods in inaccessible areas. This is a type of information we are often missing. Again, this action foresees the creation of local capacities and eventual handover to local stakeholders. These are only some of the many projects we are supporting around the world, working hand in hand with a diversity of partners. We want to build on these projects and make anticipatory action an integral part of our humanitarian activities, both in the immediate and long term. This, of course, will require learning and cooperation between a broad range of diverse actors. This is why I wish to stress that anticipatory action requires a unified nexus approach, including both development and humanitarian partners. The international community has already walked part of the way. We are not at the beginning of the learning curve. We have already gained a wealth of experience in different humanitarian settings and other disaster-prone regions. Today's event offers an important opportunity to take stock of these experiences, to reflect on the lessons learned to date and on the way forward. This will help us transition from reaction to anticipation in food assistance and pave the way for a future where there is no place for hunger and malnutrition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Lenarchic, for your intervention and for highlighting the commitment of the European Union towards scaling up anticipatory action approaches to start acting on the risk of future food crises and avoid responding, I would say, solely to the needs as they occur, as well as making it an integral part of humanitarian intervention, both in the immediate and long term. Thank you also for highlighting some of the key partnership initiatives with WFP, IFRC, FAO, and many others in this area, as well as the importance of a unified nexus approach, joining development and humanitarian partners towards this goal and ultimately contributing to eradicating hunger. Thank you very much, sir. And we will now be delighted to hear from Mr. David Beasley, Executive Director of the World Food Programme. Mr. Beasley, the floor is yours.
Dominic, it's always great to see you. Haven't seen you in a while, and hello. And Janish, it's always good to see you and to see Dong-Yong Chu, who is a man of action, who absolutely I've enjoyed working with, because, you know, there's a lot of people around the world like to talk, but Dong-Yong Chu likes to get it done. And it's great to partner with someone like that, because we are in a time in world crisis right now where we need absolute action, efficiency, effectiveness, strategic planning, because quite frankly, there's just not enough money to address all the needs on the humanitarian side right now. So we've got to be very strategic. It's like, as I've said before, the Titanic is in the open seas. We've got icebergs and we've got broken wine glass in the bar. You know, we need to not, while that's not good, we need to focus on the icebergs right now. And with limited dollars, the leaders around the world have got to focus on the icebergs, because that's where the most damage is going to take place in terms of nations and regions and globally. And we saw that, for example, in Syria, where Europe particularly didn't focus on addressing the Syrian issue. Now, how many years later, hundreds of billions of dollars, we can support a Syrian inside Syria for about 50 cents per person, versus now that same Syrian ends up in Europe, Brussels, or wherever for 50 to 100 euros per day. It's a lot cheaper to do advanced anticipatory action. I remember talking 2 years ago, Dr. Chu had just come into the scene, and we had the desert locust literally beginning to spread. And I said very clearly, you can give the FAO now $70 million, or wait and give me $700 million. Your choice. And so that was anticipatory action. We got ahead of it, and a lot of things were achieved. And it's the same message we're talking about now, because in the last few years, we've been working with FAO on anticipatory action. I've been jumping up and down, for example, in the Sahel region. And I remember, I think it was France 24, and I said, if you think Syria was a problem with about 20 million people destabilized and a few million headed your way, wait till the greater Sahel of 500 million people from the Atlantic to the Red Sea are headed your way with infiltration by extremist groups. And I said, we can't sit back and wait. We've got solutions. And so with FAO's technical expertise and our ability to reach the communities and scale up, let me just give you an example. Just in the past couple of years that we have really prepared our teams for the type anticipatory action that's going to be needed to address the fear and the factors that we're facing in the future. Because we know, like last year, out of 40 million people that were displaced, 30 million were from climate shocks and climate extremes. We're looking to 2050 that the number will be anywhere from 215, 20 million people to 1 billion people that will be internally and displaced because of climate shocks. And if we don't do something about it, as I tell my friends in the West, especially, you're going to pay for it one way or the other, because if you have famine or destabilization of nations or mass migration by necessity, it costs, just like in Syria, 10 to 100 to 1,000 times more. And guess what? And I tell this to taxpayers in all the countries, people don't want to leave home, but if they don't have food security and some degree of peace, they go do what any and all of us would do for our children. And so take the Sahel region, for example, and the rest of the world, working with our partners. Just in the last few years, we have planted billions of trees. We have rehabilitated land that otherwise not usable because of climate extreme degradation, over 3 million acres of land. We have built over 59,000 feeder roads. We have built over 50 or 60,000 holding ponds, small dams. We're not the big dam folks, reservoirs. Well, guess what? When we do that, we don't have to stay there long, because we're then giving the people the sustainability and the resilience they need, which means it saves everybody heartache and money. And so we've got solutions out there. Anticipatory action in terms of advanced financing. We just saw this in Bangladesh, where we went, see a cyclone coming. We worked with 220,000 people, gave them advanced financing so they can buy things for their livestock, buy foods in advance. It was about $4.5 million. Had we not done that, it would have cost $8 million. So anytime we can get in advance, because when you're having to come in after the fact, when the roads are shut down, power supplies and everything, infrastructure is down, it costs you at least twice as much. But because of Janish, because of this way of thinking, we're able to save taxpayers' dollars and be more efficient and more effective out there. We're facing this in many other places, like in Central America. As I've been telling the United States, what we're looking at in Central America, the number of people now talking about migrating is already doubled in the past year. And I'll give you a good, simple example. There was an article in the Washington Post that said the United States was spending $60 million per week for 1,600 sort of beds at a cost of about $3,750 per person per week, for those who've migrated all the way up to the border. While that article came out, I was in Guatemala meeting with some farmers with a program with FAO and WFP for $1 to $2 per week that was giving them food security, sustainability, so they would not have to leave. Now, what do you think the taxpayers in any country would want to do, regardless of their liberalism or conservatism? It's the right approach. So, Janish, EU, thank you for this high-level conference. And Dr. Chu, it's always good to be with you. We got a lot of work to do because we've got some serious issues knocking on our door. So thank you.
Thank you, David. We can play the complementary role to make the Janish money more efficient, more effective, more sustainable. Yeah.
Thank you, Director General, and thank you very much, Executive Director Beasley, for your intervention and for highlighting the efficiency of anticipatory action in a context of indeed constrained humanitarian resources, and of course its implication for better and more sustainable longer-term recovery. Thank you also for highlighting and illustrating the importance of working together to apply this approach in relation to climate shocks, but also in complex emergencies and in conflict settings where needs are often greatest. And of course, illustrating the key role of the WFP in that regard. So again, thank you, Director General, thank you, Mr. Lenarchic, and thank you, Mr. Beasley. As I said, even if we will not be able to have them with us today, we will be most delighted to listen to the video messages delivered by Dr. Stanislas Rachan, the Acting Minister for Development Cooperation and State Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Slovenia, and Mr. Martin Griffith, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. We'll now hear their video messages.
Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak at this event and to be given an opportunity to say a few words in favor of the action that can reduce human suffering caused by humanitarian disasters, in particular food crisis and famine. We are faced with dire humanitarian situations in different parts of the world, and extreme poverty is on the rise. I recall the statement by David Beasley, World Food Programme Executive Director, delivered after visiting Madagascar in June 2021, when he said that these situations were enough to bring even the most hardened humanitarian to tears. It seems that what is being done and the way the aid is provided is simply not enough. We need to be more efficient in using the resources we have at our disposal, but even more needs to change if we want to get ahead of the crisis curve. Those leading this smart reform argue that at least 20% of all humanitarian crises were foreseeable, yet only 1% of all available humanitarian funds were allocated for anticipatory action. Just imagine what would happen if action were taken before the crisis erupted, or if we could at least prevent its most destructive course, which sometimes takes away what has been created in generations. Imagine what it would mean to the people who suffer from food insecurity or famine and who are forced to resort to extreme coping measures for mere survival. Recalling the discussions at this year's UN high-level humanitarian event on anticipatory action in September, we can safely say that much has already been done. But our purpose now is not only to do more in humanitarian assistance, but differently, particularly in providing food aid. As leading humanitarians said on that occasion, if we can prevent crises from becoming devastating, then we would be foolish not to do so. Firm support for and promotion of action prior to the onset of a predictable hazard is also reflected in the priorities of the trio Council of EU Presidency. Developing an anticipatory humanitarian system is also a boost for building collaboration across the climate and development sectors to manage risk. Water, the main cross-cutting priority of the Slovenian Council Presidency, is a prominent example of doing exactly this. I thank the European Commission, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, and the World Food Programme for organizing this meeting and seizing the political momentum to achieve genuine and measurable progress in embedding the culture of anticipatory action in the humanitarian sector and beyond. Thank you very much.
Colleagues, thank you, Commissioner Lenarchic, for convening this event on responding earlier, faster, and more cost-effectively to growing global food insecurity. That this event is taking place just a month after the high-level event on anticipatory action speaks of the growing commitment to this smart new way of addressing predictable crises. The European Union, under your leadership, is a steadfast partner in anticipatory action. I also welcome ECHO's increasing engagement in anticipatory action, including through the efforts of the Working Group on Humanitarian Aid and Food Aid, COHAFA. Globally, 41 million people are at risk of dying from hunger in 43 countries and territories. 155 million people are acutely food insecure. We must help these people before catastrophe strikes. We need much higher levels of unearmarked funding for humanitarian response plans in countries at risk. We need unhindered humanitarian access to reach people in need. We must also do more to get ahead of predictable crises. We can predict food insecurity and famines, and when we see them coming, we need to take swift action. We know that an anticipatory approach to food insecurity works. In 2017, under the UN Secretary General's leadership, we acted on forecasts of 4 imminent famines. Donors stepped up. Nearly 70% of the funds requested were raised in just 6 months. We reached over 13 million people, and we prevented famine. Since then, we have pioneered anticipatory action at a smaller scale. Many of you are in the forefront in heralding this exciting future in the humanitarian sector. Colleagues, at OCHA, we continue to facilitate collective anticipatory action. In 2020, we provided funding from the Central Emergency Response Fund, or CERF, ahead of predictable food insecurity in Somalia due to COVID, floods, and locusts. And this led to other early financing, and together we've prevented 500,000 people from sliding into crisis and emergency levels of food insecurity between July 2020 and January 2021. Early this year, forecasts predicted drought in Ethiopia and Somalia. CERF invested $40 million for anticipatory action in both countries. We staved off acute hunger for thousands of vulnerable people at the peak of the conflict. We know that anticipatory action works. Now we must bring it to scale. And how do we do this? First, we must invest in early warning, especially at the local level, at the community level, to enable anticipatory action by governments and communities. Second, we need more financing for anticipatory action. And this includes financing to build anticipatory action plans. And this will enable us to deliver the assistance people need when they need it, and to evaluate the impact of our work so we're accountable and can do better next time. Existing humanitarian pooled funds, including the CERF, are strategically positioned to make the most effective and efficient use of available funds. Third, we must have the courage and conviction to act early if we are to deliver for the most vulnerable people. Forecasts indicate that the next rainy season will fail in the Horn of Africa. This will be the third failed rainy season in a row. Initial projections for the March to May 2022 rains are also bleak. If these forecasts become reality, this will be the first time since 1984 that 4 consecutive rains failed in that region. And in 1984, more than 1 million people died in resulting famines, and millions more were displaced. Today, we're also grappling with conflict, COVID, and other stressors in the Horn of Africa. The cost of not acting now to mitigate the impact of severe drought will be tremendous. We have a choice: to act now to deal with the current crisis and to break the cycle through anticipatory action, or to wait and see. The choice is very clear. I thank you.
Well, I would like to thank Mr. Stanislas Rachin and Mr. Martin Griffith for their remarks. And I think it was very important also to hear the call for anticipatory action in the case of the deteriorating situation in the Horn of Africa. So we'll now move to the second part of the event of today and dive straight into the technical discussion. For the first section of this, we will give the floor to colleagues who will be presenting anticipatory action initiatives in 6 different countries. And it is therefore my great honor to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Texon John Lim, who is the Director of the Office of Civil Defense at the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council of the Philippines. Mr. Lim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dominic. Good morning to everyone, or good evening, as in for people in places like ours. The Philippines is ranked as the 9th most exposed and disaster-prone country in the world. Typhoons, floods, and droughts have caused extensive damage to both lives and livelihoods, and are only getting worse due to the intensification of climate change that led to climate disasters such as Typhoon Haiyan, to which I am a survivor. We needed to change the way we manage disasters in the Philippines and have already expanded the use of our Quick Response Fund to actually adopt more of the anticipatory action principles. Over the past 5 years, the Philippine government has been working with the international community to showcase the significance of anticipatory action as an option to tackle climate extremes. We have focused on coordination and streamlining our efforts, as well as, of course, innovative measures. The Office of Civil Defense, as the executive arm and secretariat of the Philippines National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, alongside our humanitarian partners, were instrumental in setting up the National Technical Working Group on Anticipatory Action, a permanent committee under our council system, where ideas, lessons learned, and future opportunities have grown from this strong coordination. Such ideas have led to the Typhoon Surf Pilot, which builds on existing forecasting gains by the Philippine Red Cross and pulls together a wide variety of UN agencies, civil society, and the government to think of innovative solutions to protect lives and livelihoods. Of course, having mentioned the same, we thank, of course, countries such as the EU, Germany, and Canada for supporting the same. We have focused on proof of concept. Anticipatory actions have been implemented ahead of drought events in Mindanao, where empirical evidence from the FAO showed that every $1 spent on these interventions can reap rewards up to $4.4. Not only is it cost effective, the approach has also shown to support resilience efforts, curb food insecurity, and provide a more dignified approach to aid. While these gains have been made, we still have much to learn about taking the approach to scale, incorporating into policies to translate to practice, and exploring potential disaster risk financing systems. As anticipatory action continues to grow or gain momentum, we must ensure that we study, document, and share lessons learned together so that we can grow this approach, looking at what works and being honest with what doesn't will be critical for this area's success in the long haul. Rest assured that the Philippine government is committed to developing innovative measures that adopts the principles of anticipatory action and looks forward to more international cooperation relative to the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lim. And it was great to hear that the partnership, about the partnership between the Office of Civil Defense and humanitarian partners was indeed fundamental to advance the work on anticipatory action. Thanks also for highlighting that while significant gains have been made in the Philippines, for example, by setting up clear protocols to act ahead of droughts, there is still a need to grow and clearly define the way forward to bring anticipatory action to scale over the coming years. So again, sir, thank you very much for your intervention. And taking the opportunity of this virtual world, we'll go 9,400 kilometers away from the Philippines, and we'll go to Kenya. I'm now very pleased to turn to Ms. Carla Mukavi, the FAO representative in Kenya, who will speak about FAO's initiative in the country. Dear Carla, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dominic, FAO Director General, AU Commissioner, WFP Executive Director, all protocol observed, as we said in Kenya. Kenya has been feeling the impact of climate change, as seen in increased frequencies of intensifies of drought, floods, and the recent desert locust invasion. Vulnerable households that depend on rain-fed agriculture, they really bear the greatest impact of those instigated calamities. Therefore, acting ahead of shocks to mitigate their impact on livelihoods and food security is therefore an absolute priority for us. Accurate early warning information, clear thresholds that can really trigger anticipatory action, as well as flexible and reliable finance mechanisms are just some of the key preconditions. FAO is currently, I would say, really supporting implementation of a number of predictive livestock early warning information systems. And those, they enable users like National Drought Management Authority to monitor livestock diseases and pasture conditions and to act before extreme weather events. FAO support to the IPC process in Kenya has, for instance, helped to consolidate complex security monitoring and early warning information for anticipatory actions and emergency responses program over the past years. We also supported the government for desert locust surveillance and early warning, using, for instance, E-Locust 3M and E-Locust 3G. And this has really contributed to facilitate monitoring, data collection, forecasting and reporting, informing timely and effective aerial and ground control operations. Response to desert locust threat in Kenya was immediate, I should say. Between January 2020 and April 2021, the DL surveillance and control, together with the anticipatory livelihood protections interventions, allowed for the control of over 2,200,000 hectares of land in the greater Horn of Africa and Yemen, protecting the livelihoods and food security of about 39.9 million people. The outcome value of those interventions were estimated at USD 1.7 billion. And I should say that crop and milk production were saved. For instance, about 300,000 households also received livelihood support, preventing worsening of food security. And the COVID-19 pandemic, and also to mitigate expected negative impacts of movement restrictions and market disruption on productive activities, FAO provided around 400,000 cash support to vulnerable agro-pastoralists in selected counties ahead of planting season for purchase of required farms, inputs, and services. In 2017, with the assessment reports indicating likelihood of a major drought USD 400,000 was mobilized for FAO's fair anticipatory action window. And a cost-benefit analysis of those interventions showed they've showed a return of $3.5 for every $1 spent on livestock intervention. And this ratio increased to $9 when accounting for the avoided cost of response. Just last July, I should say that FAO and the government of Kenya released a joint drought action plan calling for immediate scaled up action. And the launch of this plan was timely. It really occurred months before the release of the Kenya Long Rain Assessment Report that projected the major food security deterioration towards the end of the year. And for this to happen, I should say, we really counted with the support of development partners, working in coordination with regional and sub-regional institutions, and the engagement of different stakeholders, whom we thank most sincerely, including women. And despite, I should say, all those successful examples, anticipatory action implementation still face a number of challenges in Kenya. And these include limited data availability, forecast uncertainty, limited capacities to adequately interpret those uncertainties, and the need for flexible and sufficient finance to deliver required intervention. It is really clear that anticipatory action save lives, save finance, and scarce humanitarian resources, and really safeguard the dignity of those who are most in need. Current forecasts indicate that October-December short rains will be inadequate, making it a third consecutive below average rain season. And this is of a major concern, as food security has historically deteriorated rapidly following a failed consecutive rain seasons. Though the window to act is rapidly narrowing, there is still time to act ahead of the peak of the crisis. Therefore, we really call upon development partners to support the implementation of immediate actions to anticipate a deepening of food security crisis. By investing now, we will safeguard ongoing resilience efforts and gains made during the past years. Those types of actions embedded in the long-term resilience programming are critical to protect our people and their livelihoods. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carla, for your presentation, highlighting I would say, the variety of shocks you have to deal with, and how anticipatory action is relevant in this context. And among the variety of shocks and communities you are supporting, I think I would like to really support your call for more support to pastoralist communities that are indeed often neglected. And we know that when they lose their livelihood, it's very difficult for them to get it back. You also highlighted some of the common challenge for anticipatory action implementation at scale. And I think this is indeed very important. So thank you very much, Carla. And now, following the Kenya example, it is my pleasure to turn to Mr. Pete Vogten, the Deputy Country Director for Program and Strategy at WFP Bangladesh. Pete, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me try to give you a quick overview of the WFP experience with anticipatory actions in Bangladesh. Bangladesh, which is a country that has 3 major rivers drain through it. And while at normal times, the country has already 7% of its land area covered by water bodies, during floods like the ones we had last year, more than 1/3 of the country can be covered by water. And the prospects with increasing climate change are really daunting. So following the onset of the government's 7 5-year plans in 2017, WFP introduced anticipatory actions, in particular then forecast-based financing, into its resilience work. After some preparations, when floods hit in 2019, we successfully were able to release some forecast-based cash food assistance to 6,000 households. The following year, with additional support from SURF, we managed to reach, together with other partners, around 30,000 households. Now, the impact of climate change in Bangladesh goes way beyond only riverine floods. So in 2020, ECHO supported us to look into anticipatory action for the more complex multi-hazard context that we face in the southern part of the country, where there are not only floods, but all households also are affected by cyclones, flash floods, mudslides, tidal surges. These are events which are intrinsically more hard to predict and thus need further understanding to really take them forward. Nevertheless, this year we had our first release of cash with ECHO support in response to anticipated flash flooding in the south, in the area close to where the refugees are harbored. When I look at what makes anticipatory action work in Bangladesh, it is very important to mention the role of our government partners. They are open to new initiatives. They acknowledge that more is needed if the country wants to successfully deal with the challenge that comes with climate change. Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief, therefore, has taken on itself to lead the forecast-based financing task force, which has been instrumental in harmonizing anticipatory action triggers for different disasters, resolving operational barriers, etc. We also have a number of very capable technical agencies whose capacity we further strengthen so that they can establish trigger levels and better predict floods and other types of disasters. When I look at the future prospects for anticipatory action, one of the beauties of the system is that it requires you to pre-identify vulnerable households, to understand their vulnerability. And this then not only allows anticipatory action, responding just before a disaster hits, but also early response action immediately after a disaster strikes. So in 2021, this year, when we got SURF funding, 5 agencies sat together and agreed to establish a joint database, identifying more than 100,000 vulnerable households, identifying their vulnerabilities, their characteristics. And while we didn't have any floods, luckily, of such a magnitude that there had to be anticipatory action, but one of the agencies managed to get some additional funding and used the database to actually then immediately target those vulnerable households. This is why WFP is now setting up a study to better understand and also provide evidence to our government counterparts of how anticipatory actions, early actions, help to preserve food security of vulnerable households relative to the more traditional way of responding, wherein our assistance might reach those households weeks, at times more than a few months after the actual event. We also want to explore how to involve the private sector into anticipatory action. We already have some experience involving local shops in an urban response to COVID using blockchain technology, using a technology actually that originally came from within the refugee camps. And when next year we'll have another response, we want to set up and incorporate small pilot to link local shops to this anticipatory action response. Last, but probably the most important is we want to explore how we can better integrate the use of anticipatory actions into the social safety nets of the government. Anticipatory actions can be an important tool to make those safety nets more adaptive and thus help the government to manage the impact of climate change to the country. Thank you very much, and back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Pete, for indeed reminding us of the context where you work and the particularly dire impact of climate change in a country like Bangladesh in terms of climate extremes. Thank you also for highlighting the work you do in partnership and working with the role of the government of Bangladesh, not only as an enabler, but really as the driver of these anticipatory action efforts, and the role we have as a community in providing evidence for decision making, and also in promoting innovation. You refer to several innovation, including blockchains and others. So thank you very much, Pete, for your presentation today. And again, in this virtual world, we are moving back from Asia to Africa, and we go to Senegal, where we will hear from Mr. Alhaji Abubakar Kende, Secretary General of the Nigeria Red Cross.
Yes.
Mr. Kende, you have the floor.
Yes. Thank you very much, Dominic, our moderator. Permit me to stand on existing protocol. I want to register our appreciation to the Director General, FAO, and his team, EU Commissioner, the WFP, and his team, and also the representative of the International Federation of Red Cross and Societies in attendance. I want to share the experience from Nigerian Red Cross Society on the hunger crisis intervention in 2021. As it was previously mentioned, and as you may be aware, Nigeria is already having challenges with insurgency, particularly in the northeastern part of the country, where Nigerian society continues to reach 800,000 people with food and other assistance, such as seeds, tools, and essential household items. The recent crisis actually been anticipated in the northwestern and north central Nigeria, identifies 2.53 million people at risk of food insecurity between June to August this year, due to combined impact of widespread of higher levels of conflict, impact of COVID-19 pandemic, and income earning opportunities and continued displacement of populations. There is higher insecurity, particularly related to banditry, captivity in this part of the country. The action triggers that, and this action that we already have seen in this area, triggers available in early warning reports from the region. We had also conducted need assessment to build in early warning to identify pocket under crisis, identify the target populations and their emerging needs. We are undertaking advocacy for growing crisis and the use of emergency appeal to highlight the needs of the people. This we are doing jointly with the support of the International Federation of Red Cross and Societies. Already in the affected 7 states, critically affected 7 states, we have seen and observed insufficient food, covering about 94% of the key informant interviews that were conducted actually said that it's insufficient food. And then it is very clear the issue of severe acute malnutrition among children between 6 to 59 months. We have 37%. And then there are already existing about 200,000 IDPs in 3 states of Katsina, Zamfara, and Sokoto State. The emergency appeal objectives actually that was put jointly with the International Federation has 3 key objectives. One is support the elimination of malnutrition in the Northwest and North Central region through provision of healthy feeding practice. It is also intended to provide wash services in the affected communities. Then the third objective is support the re-engagement of farmers through seed stock, access to land, and cash transfers. Reaction and intervention actions. Precisely, nutrition is one of the common kind of conditions that have been assessed in these regions. We had planned to educate communities members on health-seeking behavior, particularly related to nutrition. And then we also intended to support psychosocial support so that people can be able to withstand the hardship and the shock that is being caused by the prevailing situation. We had also observed the issue of livelihood protection, which is also very critical in this area, provides seeds and scaling up of multi-purpose cash distribution. Also to support health interventions, provide adequate access to healthcare. We also had planned to support the national society capacity building, particularly training of volunteers. The volunteers are community-based, and any support given to volunteers in terms of training, capacity building, to conduct ideas was actually strengthening the community resilience. Lessons from this, we can see that the data and triggers far shows onset crises are now identifiable, early warning. However, humanitarian funding for early action is still very much to be desired. A difficult operational environment. We have low security area in these areas, which require upfront investment in capacity building for strengthening the humanitarian pipeline. Ring fencing, financing of humanitarian interventions, such as what we have seen in the Northeast, can actually overlook needs just next to the door, with equal or more humanitarian imperative. So anticipatory action actually is very clear and very important for us to be able to mitigate and assist people in terms of preparedness. Nigerian society is actually calling for partnership on preventing the food crisis and curbing the food insecurity transition from the current shocks in Nigeria using the anticipatory actions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kende, for indeed highlighting the situation you are facing, the specific vulnerabilities, but also of course, the difficult operational environment in which you have to deliver, and for highlighting the diversity of the response provided, also for reminding us of the critical role of the volunteers. And each time I think we have to pay tribute to the Red Cross volunteers that are operating across the world. And so thank you very much, Mr. Kende. So we remain in Africa now. And next, we indeed are going to go to Senegal, where we are delighted to have with us Mr. Amadou Diallo, Country and Regional Coordinator for Crisis Anticipation and Risk Financing for the START Network. Mr. Diallo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you today. I'm going to present a summary of the Arc Replica initiative in Senegal and share with you how at the START Network we were able to successfully lead an early action response to drought that was carried out in the context of COVID-19, which exacerbated population's vulnerability in Senegal. So basically, this is a practical illustration of how innovative risk financing mechanisms can be leveraged to improve our resilience to risks and shocks under extreme and complex contexts. Just to give you some background, in November 2019, following a rainfall deficit, the African Risk Capacity Mechanism triggered, leading to a payout of around $10.6 million to the START Network and around $13 million to the government of Senegal. Around 960,000 people were exposed to the drought risk if no action was undertaken. And this payout allowed to assist vulnerable people through an early response intervention. This insurance payout from African Risk Capacity is the largest funding allocation ever to civil society for early protective actions to support communities threatened by crisis. This is very different to normal models of fundraising, which require a situation such as drought to escalate into a devastating crisis like famine before funds and action can be mobilized. It allowed us to assist around 355,000 people, with at least 50% of women in 7 regions. And despite the COVID-19 situation, our teams were able to pursue field activities at a critical time due to a great extent to the preparation we've had, and activities took place at the moment where population needed it the most. This assistance was supposed to bring support to reduce the impact of drought and avoid negative coping strategies throughout the lean season. The data we collected during independent monitoring suggests that cash and flour distributions increased household dietary diversity and decreased reliance on negative coping strategies like skipping meals, selling productive assets, etc. And this was during the period June to August 2020. The average household dietary diversity score reported by independent monitoring respondents increased also by 11% in the same period. And this is particularly impressive, given that we would typically expect HDDS to decrease as the lean season went on. Except the intervention of the government in Senegal in 2020, the START Network Early Humanitarian Response was the largest early action program run in Senegal. And this greatly supported vulnerable communities to manage a difficult lean season who would have been an unprecedented situation due to COVID-19 impact. Looking at the diversity of stakeholders in this initiative, it's important that we work together on disaster risk financing systems so that these systems aren't developing in isolation from each other, potentially reinforcing traditional silos of government, United Nations, civil society, or other. All stakeholders should come together to coordinate contingency plans backed by pre-arranged finance and can share data and risk analysis information. Finally, climate change is not a curse or a fatality. It is a phenomenon that can be scientifically understood, monitored, and through early action, we can mitigate its impact and prevent one risk to exacerbate other risks which would threaten livelihoods, peace, security, and development goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your points, Mr. Diallo, and for highlighting the interesting example of the insurance payout via the Africa Risk Capacity for early preventive action, not waiting for the drought to escalate, which is indeed a very relevant and new model of insurance mechanism. And for highlighting, of course, the positive impact on household food security, I mean, reminding us, of course, of the importance of the very good monitoring and evaluation system, for making a strong point on the importance of partnership, avoid building silos, and for ending by reminding us that climate change is not a fatality and that we can act on it. So thank you very much, Mr. Diallo, and merci beaucoup. And for our last field example, I wish to invite Ms. Randa Merigani, the head of the Humanitarian Financing Unit and manager of the Somalia Humanitarian Fund at the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, in Somalia. Ms. Merigani, over to you, please.
Thank you, Dominique, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Greetings from Mogadishu. I'd just like to start with just talking about Somalia itself. I know the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Martin Griffiths, just spoke about Somalia briefly in his speech, but I would like to just add a little bit more detail because it's been a unique experience for Somalia and for anticipatory action in general. Now, Somalia, similar to many countries in the region, it's been massively impacted by climate change. Just to give some perspective, in the last 3 decades alone, Somalia has oscillated between 13 droughts and 19 floods, which basically shows that it's a climate change driven crisis, and anticipatory action becomes all the more critical in the way that we do our business here in Somalia. So under the leadership of the Undersecretary General and the Surf Advisory Group, there was basically an initiative to explore anticipatory use of funding to complement the Surf's humanitarian response. So this resulted in the design and implementation of the first anticipatory action pilot that provided a multi-agency and multi-sector coordinated response for Somalia. That first pilot was launched last year through the OCHA managed pool fund, the SURF, and then it was followed by another one early this year because of the drought conditions in Somalia. between these two pilots, we have basically allocated 35 million for anticipatory action to the different UN agencies, funds, and programs in the space of less than 12 months for basically ensuring that we can do early action. Now, these pilots are unique in basically the size of the allocation that it was, the number of UN agencies that were involved, and the multi-sectoral response, and of course, the role of the NGOs as implementing partners through the UN agencies in this overall response. Now, there's been an evaluation that has been done for this pilot, and there's been a lot of learning that has come out of it, but I will attempt to summarize the key learning that we've had so far, and we still continue to develop as we implement, and we have an ongoing pilot right now, into 3 key points. First and foremost is the results. So what we've seen is that the right activities delivered by the best positioned actors at the right time have shown us positive results and outcomes. However, the key to ensuring this is to have the pre-agreement and to have the right stakeholders around the table, but also, and very important, is to have the community to be part of this conversation and preparing. Now, just to touch on a few of the results, and I think some of my colleagues have mentioned it, and I will just touch on a few of them, is basically the early response has allowed our beneficiaries to reduce and stabilize the food consumption gaps that they have. We've protected locust infestations has been quite widespread within the region. Hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of hectares were basically protected through anticipatory action, through our partners there. We created a safe environment for children that are very vulnerable in the setting in which we operate. And basically, we managed to foster a coordination, which was really important in institutionalizing that, not only between the humanitarian partners on the ground, but also between the government as a key counterpart and player in this, in providing humanitarian response and early action. Now, cash transfers is one of the things that has also made a great difference, and I think it has also been mentioned by some of our colleagues. Now, what are the things that we've learned within the framework? So a framework had been planned and put together a year before the response was put together. But one of the things that we've seen is very, very key and important is to have the right triggers, because the trigger is what basically starts the response. So we need to ensure that there is a collective agreement, that basically we are all the different stakeholders, and when you bring together different agencies with different specializations, we need to make sure that there's consensus that we are basically using the right triggers for that. In addition to that, what are the actual interventions that we need to put together? If we're doing a multi-sectoral, multi-agency response, then we need to make sure that we are actually picking the right interventions. And that is some of the learning that we've seen, that we need to maybe tweak a little bit what interventions and what is the timing of the interventions across different clusters. And of course, last but not least is the funding and the funding levels, which really plays an impact in terms of the response, because drought, for example, in Somalia has been pervasive in so many different parts. And so the funding level really impacts on how well and how much we can respond, whether it's localized, whether it's a little bit more cross-regional. Second of all is basically that it was without a multi-stakeholder participation, buy-in and effort, we would not have been able to implement successfully the anticipatory action pilot. Now, one of the things that was also very important is that you may have the plan, you may have everything set on the ground, but once you trigger it and the funding becomes available, we need to have clear communication amongst the different stakeholders. And that means basically emphasizing what is the commitment of the involved partners, how are we going to manage the expectations of the different stakeholders, and what is the operational readiness at the time that we need to deliver these particular activities or interventions on the ground. Last but not least is integration. So also what we've seen is that the anticipatory action framework, or the plan that was developed particularly for Somalia, it needs to be integrated into the existing humanitarian processes and response plans, such as, for example, the humanitarian response plan that is put together every year that provides an overall framework for the country. And there's also an emergency response plan that operationalizes this response. So they need to be part of these frameworks, and that will help to ensure predictability as well as sustainability. And that basically means that we've managed to institutionalize it into the existing systems. Having said that, since we are still in a pilot phase, what we've been doing is we are, as we speak now, updating these frameworks, agreeing on the triggers, on the interventions and which partners, who does what, when. And that basically is to take the learning that we've had to the next level to make sure that it becomes a more consistent, more integrated, streamlined process. And so what we've seen, just to wrap up, is that maintaining the integrity of the anticipatory action framework during the design process has proved to be one thing, but then managing it during the implementation takes another level of thoughtfulness and intentionality around some very difficult decisions sometimes. So in short, what we've seen is that anticipatory action is very much the future of humanitarian response, but we need to plan better and we need to work very well as a team to make sure that we're getting it right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mergani, for highlighting indeed the critical role of the SURF in the interagency anticipatory action pilots in Somalia. What you have learned from there, 3 keywords: results, multi-stakeholder integration, also underlining the importance of pre-agreed plans, which is indeed very important in the context, and for finishing by saying that anticipatory action is definitely part of the future of humanitarian action. So this concludes this second part of our event today, and I would like to really thank all our distinguished colleagues for sharing their experience from different parts of the world and providing these extremely valuable examples. We are now ready to head to the next section of this event, the panel discussion. And we have the pleasure to have with us today some panelists from different organizations that will help us better understand the challenge and key success factors in implementing anticipatory action. Then let me welcome and introduce the member of our panel today. We have with us Ms. Andrea Kuleima, Director at DG ECHO Directorate for Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Pacific at the EU. Mr. Leonard Mitzi, Head of Unit DG INTPA Sustainable Agri-Food System Unit. Mr. Abdi Jama, Coordinator Food Security, Nutrition and Resilience at IGAD. Mr. Rein Paulsen, the Director of the Office of Emergencies and Resilience at FAO. Mr. Brian Lander, the Deputy Director of Emergencies at WFP. Mr. Bhupinder Tomar, the Head of Country Cluster Delegation for West Africa. And Émilie Montier, the Head of Crisis Anticipation and Risk Financing for the START Network. So now moving to Ms. Andrea Kuleima. Thank you for joining us today. And let me start with you. The EU communication on humanitarian action places a strong focus on anticipatory action as a means to strengthen resilience. Can you tell us how is DG ECHO implementing this commitment and facilitating the scale-up of anticipatory action? And before you start, I would like to ask you, please, and the other speaker to try to stick to their 5-minute slot as we are already running a bit late. So thank you, Ms. Kuleima, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dominique. I'll just have a check. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay, perfect. I will try to stick to the 5 minutes. First, let me start by saying that the communication is a commission-wide document. So this commitment is not taken by just DG ECHO, but the whole commission as a whole. And furthermore, the Council, i.e. the EU member states, have supported in their conclusions the work on anticipatory action and called for its expansion in a humanitarian development peace nexus, which is something that the next speaker from the Commission will also elaborate on. The Commissioner outlined earlier this morning what we do. So let me just elaborate and explain a few aspects. First and foremost, our experience shows that both anticipatory action and early response are effective to safeguard food security. For example, preliminary results from the evaluation of an action in Bangladesh in 2020 show that there was a reduction of 32% in requests for loan post-flood amongst beneficiaries, because the cash grants which were provided ahead of the floods helped beneficiaries address their basic needs during the flood and help them repair their house and pay for livestock treatment after the flood. So in a way, it's really a non-brainer that anticipatory action makes sense. It's important, however, to be able to document that. The EU has committed to promote anticipatory action as part of our strategy on emergency preparedness. And this is not a new commitment, but one where the humanitarian aid communication and the reception it got motivates us to build on and expand further. We have a dedicated budget line, emergency preparedness budget, which Commissioner Lenarchic referred to, with an annual budget of approximately 75 million euros. And the first of the priorities of this budget line for 2020-2024 is risk and anticipatory action, whereas the other priorities are complementary to that. And I was very pleased to hear earlier on the experience in Philippines in adopting anticipatory action strategies, which build, amongst others, on two eco-funded disaster preparedness projects, the Move Up, Moving Urban Poor Towards Resilience, and SUPAS, Support to Urban Preparedness Through Preemptive Action. And these two projects have been instrumental in working with local government units on contingency planning and other capacity building activities. We are also progressively mainstreaming anticipatory action in our humanitarian response projects when this is possible and relevant. We have made significant progress, but I can tell you, Dominique, more can be done. An example is our support complemented by development funding to the locust response in East Africa with FAO. This is a key area where the humanitarian community needs to progress in terms of documentation, as well as communication of the effects of early and anticipatory action, so it can then help in the mobilization of funds among competing priorities. One commitment that ECHO is taking following the communication is that we want to keep learning. Anticipatory action has demonstrated its effectiveness for climate shocks, but we need further piloting in complex emergencies to address compound and multiple shocks. For example, conflicts, urban settings, situations of displacement, and the EU is also promoting pilots in those scenarios. Anticipatory action needs flexible and stable funding. So we are also developing new financing modalities adapted to these needs. Commissioner Lenarchic referred to the Programmatic Partnership that we just concluded with FAO, which is a multi-year, multi-country, and which has a focus on anticipatory action for food security. In that context, let me refer again to the importance of local action, which is key in anticipatory action. After more than a decade of support to DREF, the IFRC Disaster Relief Fund for local response, we have now expanded the support to include forecast-based action as part of the local response that this entails. And we're in discussion with IFRC for a pilot programmatic partnership as well on strengthening the capacities of local Red Cross societies to do indeed that immediate and early response to disasters, including food-related disasters. We are conscious that anticipatory action implies working with a variety of partners, including local development and peace actors, i.e. having this nexus approach. And in relation to that, we see an opportunity to establish a more robust link between anticipatory action and social protection as an aid delivery mechanism. This would entail strengthening social protection systems by making them shock responsive, i.e. adapting them in advance of crisis, so they are reactive and able to provide a timely assistance to those in need when the disaster actually strikes. To wrap up, a meeting like this one is a great opportunity to capitalize on our own experience with a view to scale up. The first step is creating a body of knowledge through guidelines, good practices, trainings. Then, of course, the challenge is to roll this up, to disseminate internally and externally, and progressively incorporate anticipatory action and resilience building into the operational culture across the aid community, both the humanitarian aid community, but also the development one. Thank you, Dominique.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for clearly indicating how ECHO turns political commitment into action. I think with increased resources and others, and knowledge and innovation. So thank you very much, Andrea. Changing Directorate General, but remaining at the EU level, I would like to ask Mr. Leonard Mitzi, and ask him, Leonard, following what Andrea said, could you please expand on connections and synergies between development programs and anticipatory action schemes implemented by humanitarian actors. Leonard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dominic,
and
thanks to all colleagues. And first of all, thanks to colleagues in ECHO, at FAO and WFP. I just want to take a proposal of Pete from Bangladesh earlier on. I think today's event is an important event coming just after the UN Food Systems Summit and midway into the COP in Glasgow, to have a bit of a systems approach thinking of a compilation of what all the partners, humanitarian development, the peace nexus, conflict resolution, can do together under anticipatory action. It's not going to be easy because this is, again, systems thinking around risk management tools, products like insurance, finance, innovative finance. We didn't speak much about innovative finance, but this is also going to be critical in terms of typology of finance. Bonds, do they work? Do they don't work? I saw also discussions in the comments around gender mainstreaming. How gender sensitive are we in terms of anticipatory action, in terms of biases or not? Digital, AI and blockchains were mentioned. Is this all hype? Is this fluff? Or is there true potential? Geospatial data. So I think a compendium, maybe all the partners can sit together in terms of what's working at country level, at regional level, at global level, what's scalable and what's not scalable, and what are the financing gaps. If today's meeting can trigger this compendium of a wealth of information, of success stories, of stories that can maybe reach scale, I think this could also be an opportunity for finance, for private sector operators, for NGOs to actually take home a delivery product from this event. I will not mention the figures that were mentioned by the high-level panelists, which stemmed from the global report on food crisis. I just need to reiterate what many of you said. We clearly need to address the root causes of today's food crisis: conflicts, economic shocks, climate change, and clearly the COVID pandemic. We are maybe a bit out of it in Europe, but we are still not totally out of it from a global context. And the situation is not looking good in a number of hotspots across the globe. This clearly requires, and this was a conclusion in the UN Secretary General Chair's summary, a transformation of global and local agri-food systems to be more inclusive, more resilient, more sustainable. And we, as European Union, have the EU Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy as our guiding lights in terms of our rollout. I would like, in practical terms, to mention 3 building blocks of where I see a systemic approach to fighting food crisis. First of all, my first building block is to support a transition towards agri-food systems that are economically, environmentally, and socially sustainable, which means achieving food and nutrition security and resilience to crisis. We are doing, as you know, a number of rapid agri-food systems analysis across basically the globe. One of the concrete examples, and this was mentioned from Senegal, is our support to the African risk capacity. We invested 5 million euros in collaboration with ARC and WFP in an ongoing project that aims to understand the links between climate-related disasters and response to food crisis. Here, the objective is to strengthen ARC's delivery model, especially capacity building in disaster risk management of the African Union member states, in the production and improved country risk profiling and improved contingency planning, taking into account both emergency humanitarian actions and longer-term post-crisis development actions to build community and household resilience. Second, support, similar, is the one to local, regional, and global information systems on food insecurity. Since 2016, INTPA engaged the global network in the production of timely, reliable, and consensus-based information on food crisis and food insecurity. We have now today with us a reference methodology, the IPC, and comparable cadre harmonisé, regional platforms, West, East, Southern Africa, and Central America, as a global public good, which is the Global Report on Food Crisis and its updates. The FAO and WFP, early warnings on acute food insecurity, hunger hotspots, the report to the members of the UN Security Council on food insecurity in countries with conflict situation, and other initiatives are clearly building blocks, which are triggered by the information which is updated systematically from the global report. All of these ensure preventive, early, and evidence-based responses to food crisis. A second building block is multilateralism. We have, as a commission, a multilateralism communication, and besides what we said earlier on in terms of the coordination hub and the role of the coordination hub, Rome-based and beyond, from the UN Food System Summit, we would like that events such as the Nutrition for Growth in Tokyo, the COP in Glasgow, Kunming this month, are actually communicating to each other. We speak a lot of silos, but sometimes the systems thinking across events, it's as if environmental ministers go to COP and we forget what happened in New York, or humanitarian actors speak, which is not linked maybe to all the systems thinking, including what will happen in the events ahead. We will have the EU-Africa Summit. All these events should not just be summits, should not be just what we call summaries of big maybe pledging, but also systems transformation at country level. This is going to be key, and this is a building block that the European Union is close to heart, the multilateral dimension. Amongst the actions and initiatives at EU level that I just would like to quote are the Council conclusions on the EU priorities for the UN Food System Summit, which was at the base of our positioning in New York, is the preparedness for food crisis, and once again, how to operationalize better the global network at all levels, at local, regional, and global. Last but not least is better, closer collaboration and coordination across the UN agencies and fora. Third point is to deliver on effective humanitarian development and peace nexus using the global network against food crisis and supporting the Fighting Food Crisis Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus Coalition that has emerged amongst one of the coalitions of the UN Food System Summit. In the coming weeks, we will hold discussions with our partners of the global network on the use of around 20 million euros for the next years to continue building an effective humanitarian development peace nexus to fight food crisis at different levels. Over to you, Dominique.
Thank you very much, Leonard, for your very rich intervention, for reminding us of the importance indeed for the system approach and the role tools such as the global network against food crisis can play in that. I also retain your very clear call for knowledge generation, compilation of knowledge as a clear, concrete outcome of this particular meeting. Thank you very much, Leonard. And I now move to Mr. Abdi Jama, the coordinator of food security, nutrition and resilience of IGAD. And I would like to ask Mr. Jama what capacities exist in your region to implement anticipatory action, including coordination mechanism, and what challenges, obstacles prevent government from implementing them more broadly. Could you share any promising example from your region? Mr. Jama, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Dominique. Good morning, good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I think you mentioned coordination, so I will focus on coordination. I will focus on the Regional Food Security and Nutrition Working Group for East Africa and for Southern Africa. It's a platform that we share with FAO. It collates it also involves other UN agencies, FUSNet, member states, a whole host of partners in the region. It is supposed to be a one-stop shop for information and early warning in the region. It's because of this that from the IGAD side, we have recently incorporated and included the FSNWG, the Resilience Analysis Unit, the IPC. This is now represented in the IGAD Food Security, Nutrition, and Resilience Analysis Hub based at IGAD Climate Center in Nairobi. Its role is to collate information from agencies and from member states and present a regional interview by country and by thematic areas. We have 7 or so subgroups from food security, nutrition, displacement, markets, livestock, and pastoral issues. Our main objective is to raise the food crisis issue of food and advocate for anticipatory action. Some of the products we produce are monthly reports. We have a monthly meeting, and in these monthly meetings, we provide a summary of the food security and nutrition situation in the region and by country. We also provide snapshots when there are certain issues that we want to zoom in. We provide snapshots and we produce these snapshots. We also produce alerts when sometimes, for example, there's the below rainfall weather in East Africa. We provided in collaboration with FAO and other agencies, we provide alerts on these things. And more recently, we produce regional focus of the global report on food crisis. We zoom into our region, and we have a separate report in addition to the world global one. We work with FSIN, Food Security Information Network, and the UN and other partners that are also based in East Africa. So instead of taking the information from the global food crisis, we contribute to the food crisis and we produce our own report. So we launched very recently our regional focus, IGAD regional focus on food crisis. But most importantly, in addition to these early warning things, we also have, when there is an issue or there's a problem of food crisis in parts of the region, we provide, we press releases and send it to different parts of the media through our communications. A case, we also, for example, for the desert locust, we have press conferences. We, together with FAO and ELCO in the region, we organize press conferences. And I think one of the, some of the challenges that are in the region are the same with other issues. One of the issues is there's sometimes too much information and not actionable, particularly the issue of conflict information, even though at IGAD we have a conflict early warning network to get an update on food, on conflict, on displacement, on food security situation. It's not easy. We also, most of the information in the region are project-based. I think that the FAODG talked about mainstreaming this early action and anticipatory action on an early warning on in the national strategies of the member states. Most of these things, unfortunately, are based on projects, and they come and go along with the project. So the one example I can give in our region is the issue of the desert locust. I think for the most part, we haven't seen this level of desert locust invasion for a very long time. We have press conferences, we have press releases on this, not necessarily doing the action, the response ourselves, but providing platform for mobilizing the member states to come together and to share lessons. We have, I think the issue of desert locust is covered through IGAD press releases. It's most widely covered issue in the IGAD region at present. We have established a separate task force for this that is leading the member states and partners on the issue of desert locust on a weekly basis. And we have 3 ministerial conferences as a result of IGAD action. It was the African Union that asked IGAD to provide a platform for the countries to share experience and to coordinate the response in the member states. And to that extent, IGAD had developed a food security strategy in response to desert locust, floods, and the COVID-19, which is very rampant also in member states. So the IGAD Food Security and Nutrition Working Group has been a leader in this food crisis issues, and really have played a big role in making an anticipatory action, or at least providing the information basis for some of these for anticipatory action. And
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abdi, and thank you indeed for reminding us of the importance of coordination and the role bodies such as the Food Security and Nutrition Working Group is contributing in providing the evidence that leads to indeed anticipatory action, and for reminding us always that information is important as long as it is for decision making. So thank you very much. Let us now turn to my colleague of the FAO Director of Emergencies and Resilience, Mr. Rein Paulsen. Rein, we'd like to ask you the following question. In the light of extremely concerning acute food insecurity trends outlined in the event today by several speakers, what is your perspective on the kind of intervention we need to stand a chance of curbing such trends? What is the relevance of FAO's work in protecting livelihood in that respect? Rein, the floor is yours.
Dominic, thank you so much, and hello, Excellencies and colleagues. Good to be with everyone to discuss such an important topic. So thank you for the time today. So a few thoughts in response to, I think these really pertinent questions, Dominic. And we've heard, I think, clearly from all the panelists and discussants today, clearly, compellingly about the alarming trends when it comes to food security, and related to that, the challenges then that we are facing now and that we are likely to face in the near future, which we collectively need to find a way to address. And of course, the humanitarian sector and humanitarians have continuously prided themselves on being a home for innovation, having a continual focus on these questions of how we improve the efficiency of our actions, the efficiency of aid, all in support of ever better outcomes for the communities that we're looking to serve. So this is clearly something that has been a hallmark of humanitarian action. And yet, as we reflect on that together today, and we hear the interventions that are being made, and we reflect on the way in which we are working in the largest crises globally in these protracted emergency contexts as well, I think it's fair to say that we look in its majority at activities that are fundamentally similar in modalities and approaches to ones that we have had in the recent past. Yet the scale of our collective action has grown. I think last year, and colleagues online may be able to correct me, but in terms of orders of magnitude, some $20 billion were mobilized in support of humanitarian action. So there's clearly responses that are taking place at scale. But as we heard a number of interveners today comment, and indeed Director General Chu, I think, used a key phrase in this regard. We have a system that's fundamentally still based on reaction. It's a reactive system. It's based on working after an event happens. It's post facto activities. And this is something we do need to ensure that we find a way to address. It obviously doesn't mean that the whole model that we have is outdated. Clearly, an ability to quickly understand when an event happens, what those needs are, where those needs are located, and how we respond to them is key, and responding to them efficiently is key. But as we've reflected on this together today, and as we understand the purpose of our discussions today and the need for an anticipatory approach collectively, I do think these questions around what we can do differently, what we can do better, how to affect the change that we want to see in a truly lasting fashion is key, not least when we understand what's happening in terms of the frequency of crises, and not least when we reflect on our deepened shared understanding of the complexity of issues in the context in which we're operating. So today's event, I think, is key. It doesn't necessarily give a complete answer to everything, but it does provide some important elements of the right answer to these questions. It's not a great feat of logic to understand that predictable crisis should be managed earlier. I think we're all convinced of that. But part of the answer too is not just about the timing of the interventions, it's also about the type of interventions and the kind of assistance that we provide to people. And so just to say in that regard that evidence clearly shows that protecting livelihoods, protecting people's ability to produce food, to generate income, to mitigate asset depletion, to mitigate dangers of growing debt burdens in response to crisis, that this is key. And a focus on livelihoods can and will transform the way in which disasters affect households, communities, and ultimately countries, and prevent the progressive loss of assets that ultimately result in the most severe forms of hunger. And you'd probably expect me to talk about livelihoods, but I think if we're driven by context and driven by needs, if we consider that 80% of people currently in high acute food insecurity are farmers, are herders, are fishers, are foresters in rural areas, who all depend on agriculture for survival. This tells us that a focus on protecting livelihoods using an anticipatory approach is ultimately fundamental to the type of transformative change that we want to see happen. We've heard from a number of people on the panel, and it's been fascinating to listen to these examples of country experiences. We've heard some compelling examples. Let me give just one other very quick example from Yemen this time. So hundreds of thousands of families, as we know, in Yemen face ongoing imminent threat to their sole source of income as a result of easily preventable animal diseases. And this, as we know, is already taking place in a context which is arguably the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And we know at the same time that just $8 of interventions to vaccinate and to deworm a small herd of sheep and goats, 5-6 animals, can protect $500 worth of assets for these families. It has an immediate impact in terms of milk production, increasing this by sometimes as much as 20%, with enormous immediate impacts on household nutrition, and clearly then especially amongst children. So FAO has over the years been able to measure and quantify the avoided impacts on livelihoods as a result of these types of activities. And our evidence And I do think it's really important, and I appreciate the fact that Andrea and Leonard have reminded us just why it is so important for us collectively to build this body of evidence and to communicate this body of evidence. This evidence shows us that not only is it cost effective in terms of the way we work, with returns of up to $9 for every dollar invested, but we also know that the evidence shows us that anticipatory action will curb food insecurity, will improve nutrition, and will contribute to social cohesion. And I do think it's important that we understand beyond these very immediate impacts, there are also longer term positives that it's really important to understand and communicate on as well. We know that people who face hunger take drastic actions. Obviously, they cut meals, they resort to pulling children out of schools, extreme measures such as selling off land or assets, migrating. We heard David Beasley talk about that at the beginning of our event today. As such, it's clear that protecting people's livelihoods against shocks has benefits that reach far into the future. So if this is the context, if this is what we know, then I do think we also need to be honest with ourselves that currently there is a significant and stark imbalance of funding and consequently the type of assistance that's being delivered. An analysis by the Global Network Against Food Crisis recently indicates that over the past 5 years, the agriculture sector has been receiving less than 10% of humanitarian assistance to the food sector. And within that, even less, a very small amount is available for anticipation, only a tiny fraction. Some studies talk about less than 3% of all the funding available of humanitarian financing is for prearranged activities to be implemented once warning materialize. So it's clear, it needs to be crystal clear, it should be crystal clear that we cannot afford to do more of the same. We need a transformation of the approaches that we're using, moving from simply reactive to something that is much more ethically appropriate and much more efficient from an intervention perspective. We need to make sure we're not just scratching the surface of needs. And clearly, the future of food crisis interventions need to be integrated. And here I would fully support and echo the comments of many on the call, not least the compelling messages that Leonard Mitzi from INPA was sharing with us around the imperative for a systems approach. We need integrated interventions to help manage risk more effectively, not just manage the impacts. We need to connect humanitarian resilience and peace investments in a way that sustainably reduce needs over time. There's a lot more that I could say, but let me stop there in the interest of time. Back to you, Dominic. Thank you.
No, Doc, you could say much more. Right? Thank you very much. And thank you for reminding us of the need to make sure our system is indeed updated. I think important to focus, of course, on livelihood as part of anticipatory action. 80% of the people in food crisis depend on agriculture for their livelihoods. Thank you very much, Rain, for that. And now let me move to Brian Lander of the World Food Programme. Brian, as we know, conflict remains the main driver of humanitarian needs, acute hunger and famine in particular. Can we apply the anticipatory approach in fragile conflict-affected states? And what are the practical implications? What can and should be done to prevent the deterioration of the humanitarian situation in conflict setting? And how, of course, is WFP changing to adapt to these new needs? Brian, the floor is yours. And good to see.
Thanks, Dominique. Thanks, Dominique. I'm glad you've raised this question on conflict, and we could probably add to that insecurity in general and how it does relate to the work that we're trying to do on anticipatory action. Is probably one of the more difficult areas to apply this approach, but I think we're making progress. And certainly there are clear ideas on how we can improve that and to look to respond more effectively in advance of a deterioration in situations. But maybe just quickly to cover a little bit of the scope of the issue around conflict. Famine, driven by conflict, but also we can't forget climate shocks and economic downturns, really also exacerbated by COVID-19, are really pushing a large population around the world to the brink of famine. We're looking at approximately 41 million people that are on this cliff edge of famine. And in the Global Report on Food Crisis in 2021, which covered around 50 countries, we saw that in 2020, conflict was the key driver of much of the need that we saw out there in 23 countries, which accounted for about 64% of acute food insecurity amongst these populations. So it's clear that this is a growing trend and a growing issue that we have to grapple with. In addition, the FAO WFP Hunger Hotspots report from July this year alerted on intensifying violence in a number of key places, not the least Afghanistan that we've seen recently, Central Sahel, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, just to name a few of them that are the more prominent, but there are others where we're seeing disturbing trends which are raising concerns and really should be triggering us into action. 80% of humanitarian needs are in fragile and conflict settings around the world today. And by 2030, according to the World Bank, we're looking at potentially 2/3 of the world's extreme poor living in these situations. So we've already got the information, we've got the triggers. It's just then how do we respond in advance of that to help people? So while we move from this reactionary approach to something more anticipatory, we also need to think about applying the practice that we've established in looking at natural hazard risks and extending those out to conflict settings. I think the natural hazards has been a primary focus up until now, and I'm not suggesting that we haven't tried to do that in conflict, but I think there is a real impetus now to apply that. So what can we do? Well, first of all, anticipatory action begins with early warning and the analysis that goes behind that. So if we have a given that conflict is a primary driver, then we really need to do this conflict risk analysis. It's got to be allowing us, enabling us to better predict when there's conflict that will outbreak or deteriorate. And it's got to be an integral part of our early warning systems as we look at anticipatory shocks and avoiding those blind spots. This includes developing scenarios and forecasting the impact on communities, looking at what it is, the context that we're looking at. We need to have that detailed understanding of who are the actors involved, what are their intentions, what are the dynamics, and an anticipated impact on the ground. Those factors need to be brought into our early warning analysis. But there are also other challenges, because as we do engage in this analysis, it can be perceived as somewhat politically sensitive. And I think we need to get beyond that perception and acknowledge that this is a significant driver of what's going on in the world, and we need to mitigate against that perception and allow for that analysis to happen without jeopardizing the neutrality of the actors who then respond to those situations. So I think that's a key understanding that we need to grapple with as we go forward in terms of that analysis. And we're getting better at responding, I think, in anticipation. We are putting in place preparatory actions, and we are attempting to drive earlier responses, and particularly by developing contingency plans, putting in place readiness measures with our teams on the ground, and really embedding a no regrets kind of approach, a mentality to it, that if we're going to be able to be effective in this, we have to put those resources and assets out there. This includes rapid targeting of populations, implementing cash-based and in-kind systems in a way that diminishes the impact on communities. And hopefully, some of those actions may promote resolution, or at least an avoidance of a deteriorating security or conflict situation on those communities. So I think as we think through what do we put on the ground, how can we also impact, in a way, the peace situation on the ground? We also deploy staff, expert staff, and putting that capacity up front, and develop access strategies to these communities should the conflict or insecurity break out. So within, just as a short example, within WFP, we have developed what we call a corporate alert system, which regularly reviews situations of food security around the world and and drives a common narrative within the organization. And I think this is an important lesson in the sense of it provides a basis for a mindset, I think, within the organization. We're all on the same page as to what are the situations that are of concern, what should we be thinking about in terms of responding more effectively in advance of these crises. So I think it's helpful to have that analysis and that framing of it in an alert system, certainly within WFP, but perhaps wider amongst the wider community of humanitarian and development actors. So I think this helps prioritize corporate attention. It prioritizes resources, support to those field operations that need it, and assures timely and coordinated anticipatory action and preemptive responses. Maybe just a couple of examples of what that might look like in practice. So ahead of some of the challenges we saw in Afghanistan, we did develop a plan that would pre-position assets in and around the country. And in particular in Tajikistan, Iran, Pakistan, and others. This allowed us to put commodities and material in areas, including a logistics hub in Uzbekistan, and it served as storage facility, which was on hand and ready should the needs rise, which we're seeing now, as we've heard earlier. This front loading of stocks and resources allows us to scale up quickly. And in addition, we're looking at our fleet of trucks, which we can expand to some 240. So it's just an example of where we saw things going potentially wrong, although the conflict still remains somewhat uncertain. We are putting already in place those means to be responding at scale. Just a couple of small points in addition. I know we're behind time. I think we also need to be looking at mitigating the impact of climate risks through anticipatory action, how that can then relate to conflict and how it's destabilizing communities. We've seen several studies that demonstrate the relationship between climate change and conflict. So climate change as a driver of people seeking resources and support and needs that are no longer there. It can rapidly change the dynamic on the ground that can lead to intercommunal violence and other forms of conflict. And political unrest for that matter. So I think we do need to explore that link between climate change and how does it precipitate then the wider concerns around conflict. And so I think as we think about mitigating that climate risk, let's also build in that aspect of where could this go? What sort of political implications does it have for those communities? And then maybe a little bit more broadly, building on that a little bit, I think we also recognize that as we look at the analysis, as we look at the type of anticipatory action that we need to couple that with political engagement. Now, as I mentioned before, we are concerned how that impacts on neutrality of humanitarian actors, but there are political actors out there that can take this work forward. And I think taking that analysis and then applying it in a collaborative way, in a cooperative way, with those that can engage in political processes, whether it's humanitarian diplomacy, whether it's human rights diplomacy, or whether it's political diplomacy, I think all of that needs to be brought together in a more concerted way. And let's call it preventive humanitarian diplomacy in general, that allows for us to get the access we need to put in place those assets as we respond more effectively. So I'll stop there, Dominique. Thank you very much for giving me the floor.
Thank you very much, Brian, for indeed touching the important issue of anticipatory action in conflict setting, keeping in mind that indeed conflict is the main driver of acute food insecurity. I think affecting about 100 million out of the 155 in acute food insecurity. So very big main driver. So let me now move to our next speaker, and I would like to address a question to Mr. Bhupinder Thomas, Head of Country Cluster Delegation for West Africa at IFRC. I did not mention IFRC when I introduced him first. Beginning with the first pilots in Togo and Uganda developed in 2014, the Red Cross national societies have been pioneering the forecast-based financing. There are currently 14 national societies in the region working towards developing the approach. What has been the key lessons learned on the challenge and opportunities to apply it for food security? And I would like to ask you, Mr. Tomar, please to be brief, as I would like to allow some time for a 1-minute question to each of the panelists. So please try to be brief. And sorry to push you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic, and I'll try my best to be brief. I think, first of all, thank you for inviting us today to this forum and this dialogue. I think in the continuation of dialogues at various levels, I'm sure this will add to our increasing voice in trying to make humanitarian actions, ex ante and not continue to remain exposed in some sense. So as you said, we've sort of used the last 5 or 6 years to take some of this thinking that has been around for almost 15 years now. We first opened a climate center in early 2000s to try and use climate risk information to already inform our humanitarian action, and largely, as some speakers mentioned today, around natural-based risk and around hydrometeorological risk to some extent. But since then, I think what we've done is to sort of try and learn from those approaches and use almost a decade and a half of learning to try and sort of bring it down to some operational changes within this, to change that request that one of the speakers made today about, how do we systematically change it? So from our side, I think there are 2 lessons that sort of stand at top of that. One is that, you can have anticipatory financing actions, or you can have forecast-based financing, but none of that would change local action unless you invest into that local capacity. And so that investment that was needed even earlier on sort of local capacity building and in disaster preparedness at local levels, so that the types of intervention needed are known and types of intervention are very clear and they are not complex, and they are very easily linked to the availability of financing at whatever scale that it's available. I think that helps move that sort of concept to sort of real action in some sense. And I couldn't agree more with Brian to say that there's lessons to take from that natural risk to even to fragile settings. And we are trying to do that here in Nigeria, but more generally in Sahel, in sub-Saharan Africa. And the thing there is very simple. If you've invested in building the local capacity of a National Red Cross or any local actor, your ability to humanitarian, access those places just increases dramatically. What is the challenge that we have in northeast of Nigeria or north of Nigeria today is that humanitarian access is very restricted. And why is it restricted? Because we just don't have capacity on the ground to be able to access it. So not just lack of money, it's also lack of capacity to deliver. And I think from that perspective, our top lesson is that we would need to continue to build on that disaster preparedness investment. The ECHO mentioned they are investing about 75 million. We ourselves are investing about 100+ million every year on trying to build our national actors and trying to build their local capacity. And so we urge everybody on this forum to try and come together for that particular action, try and ensure that a lot of our talk and a lot of our summaries translate into this action at the local level to try and build that capacity. The second point I think I wanted to make in terms of the lessons that we've learned is that we will reduce to minimize complexity. There is already too much complexity in forecast-based financing or forecast-based actions or early actions, as we're calling it today. What is that complexity? Forecasts by nature are unpredictable. They are probability-based scenarios. And so there is inherent risk built into that for failure. But the approach that we want to take, and I think we have learned it the hard way, is that you want to have a no-regret strategy. And I think Brian mentioned it just before me, that if you take that no-regret strategy, then all the numbers that you heard today on this panel, the ratios between what you invest $1 and what you get, in return on that investment, or from a cost perspective, the lower the cost of prevention action is much more lower, sometimes even 1/4 of the cost of response action. I think WFP Executive Director made it even more explicit from the US example. But we know that those numbers exist because in some ways, we've known this for a long time now, that the evidence has accumulated for us to know that this is the case. And so the question we have is that how can we reduce that complexity from the risk-based models that we have in terms of early actions? And the answer is that we should have no regrets approach, because investments both in preparedness and investments in early response will lead you to better results. And even if those models fail sometimes, which they will fail, then there is no regrets there, because anyway that investment was needed from a preparedness angle, right? And so we, from our perspective, I think what we're saying is that we should reduce complexity and try and make these things very simple. And in that respect, I think what we're asking for, both on the response side from the community itself, but also from the financier side, whether it is the financing instruments or it is the donor community, all of us to agree on some easy action protocols, because the more clearly the early action protocols are defined, the better we will be able to utilize the information and analysis that everybody has talked about, but also to be able to clearly, agree on the triggers, because part of the challenge is that, in a very sudden onset natural disasters, the triggers are very clearly visible. The news and the social media, clearly identify those triggers for you. But in a slow onset, in a complex emergency, in a fragile state, sometimes those triggers are not very clear, and trying to create a consensus on them can take its own time. And so if there are easily agreed protocols, and of course linked to some easily identifiable triggers, linked to some verifiable information and data, I think we have a very simple system that can work. And we are trying to do that in our own system. So in our house, we've just restructured, I think 4 years back, our pooled fund for humanitarian response. It's called, as Echo was saying, it's called Disaster Relief Emergency Fund. And what we've simply done is to allow within the protocols for people to ask money for early actions. And those protocols have been clearly identified. So people are trained for looking for those triggers, and therefore then articulate those triggers and ask for financing around that. And we are very happy to see that the donors has sort of appreciated that, but also the governments where we are working in the countries are starting to look at this model and say, how could we institutionalize it and how could we scale it up? And I think on that point, my last point today is that I think funding is a challenge for us for anticipatory actions and forecast-based financing. But it is also an opportunity for us in the sense that it can change the way the system currently works, which is exposed, right? And we can make it ex ante if we try and link that financing to ex ante triggers. And I give back to you, Dominic. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas. One thing for reminding us of the absolute centrality of investment in local capacity. I think this was one of the key points of the many key points of your intervention. Let me go now to Emilie Montier of the START Network. And I would like, Emilie, to ask you if you could tell us what opportunity does anticipatory action offer to unlock ownership at local level, and how does this ensure its sustainability? Emilie, the floor is yours. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about locally led ownership in the context of anticipatory action. And I'll be building on the excellent comments made by Mr. Thomas previously. So for me, one of the most exciting things about anticipatory action is not just about the timing, which is of course so important, but it's also about the opportunity that it unlocks for different forms of coordination, different forms of decision-making ahead of time. As we've heard from the many examples today of anticipatory action from those field examples, a lot of what anticipatory action involves is about analyzing risks ahead of time, setting triggers, putting in place plans, putting in place financing, all ahead of the crisis event. And this offers different opportunities to actually engage in a deeper way with communities at risk ahead of time and engage with those frontline community responders as well. So for example, we heard the example from my colleague in Senegal who talked a little bit about the collaboration with the government in drought anticipatory system. But also we have another system in Pakistan, a disaster risk finance system, which supports this network of NGOs to get ahead of 3 different types of hazards: floods, droughts, and heat waves. And there's a collaboration there, a network of organizations of local and national NGOs working together with INGOs, working together with local authorities as well, and representative from the National Disaster Management Agency. And they're working together to do things like set these triggers, work in terms of what actions are needed when and where and for whom when crisis scenarios emerge in the future. And I think this kind of opportunity then to push this decision-making and decentralized decision-making more ahead of crises is particularly interesting in the case of food crises. And that's because of the complexities of food crises, which we've heard a lot about today. If we take the example of anticipating a flood situation, we might have a kind of 10-day window between receiving a forecast and actually the onset of that crisis. If we take a food crisis, as we've discussed today, that can unfold over months, if not years even. And actually, there's so many different windows of opportunity to do things to support communities with different kinds of actions at different moments of time. And if you can imagine the complexity of that you have, say, $30 or $60 per person to support them, where do you time, how do you target that assistance? What are the most effective windows of opportunity when those community members want support, and what kind of supports do they need? Because often in anticipatory action, we talk about mitigating the impact or avoiding losses, but it's without having a really nuanced understanding of what loss, for whom, where, that actually we can understand what are we trying to achieve and evaluate the effectiveness of those systems that we set up. And we had some comments today in the chat about gender and about the importance of integrating those perspectives, because we know that women, for example, or women-led farmer households experience risks in different ways, or may need or want support in different ways to male farmers or male-headed households. And actually, it's that kind of nuanced understanding of what we're trying to do that's particularly important. And Start Network produced a research on this earlier this year, which we will be sharing shortly. And so obviously then the second point that we're saying there is then who's best placed to actually decide on what is needed and when. And it's of course, the people who know the best, which are the communities who are actually at risk of these crises, or those frontline local responders who are embedded in those communities as well. So engaging these local responders, having them part of the system, it's not just the right thing to do, but actually it's going to ensure the effectiveness of what we're trying to do. It's going to ensure that level of nuance that we need to be able to set up those systems and ensure their sustainability. And the last point just to make from the Start Network side, I think often when people think of locally led, they think, oh, that's small scale, or it's patchwork, it's too difficult to scale. But actually on the Start Network side, what we've been trying to do, and this year we're launching the Start Financing Facility, which is a global infrastructure that actually supports those locally led networks with access to things like risk analytics, collective planning, pre-arranged financing that's organized efficiently using a different number of crisis response mechanisms, and actually enabling us to scale this locally led action and ensure the effectiveness and sustainability of these systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily, again for reminding us, among many things, of the importance of local responder to ensure effective responses, and of course, presenting the role of the Start Network. Well, colleagues, as you have seen, we are running short of time, but still there was a very rich exchange in the Q&A and in the chat. So we have quite a number of questions from the audience, and we would like to allow for 1 minute quick response from each of the panelists on the following. And first, I would like to go to Ms. Kuleima and Mr. Mitzi with the following question. Absence of development programs in vulnerable areas is one of the factors contributing to increased vulnerability and therefore the need of emergency or anticipatory action programs. Anticipatory action funding is mainly channeled through humanitarian funding channels. Would it be not more logic to have anticipatory action funding also part of development funding? Quite a long question, but I'm asking you for a very short answer. Ms. Kuleima, if you want to go first, 1 minute, please.
Okay, I think it's not an either or, and I'm sure Leonard will elaborate on what is done from the development side on this. I would like maybe to elaborate a bit on the question. For me, the most challenging aspect in this discussion is how to move from a solely needs-based approach to a risk-based one. This requires indeed a mental shift to fully adopting a no regrets approach. But what the question is pointing out to is that it also requires to create a sufficient financial space to invest resources in response to needs that have not yet materialized, whilst we are at the same time facing acute needs which might have materialized. And that's a big ethical dilemma as well that we have on the humanitarian side. So we need to enlarge this donor base and create that space so that we can do both at the same time, and so that we gear the international system, humanitarian and development together, to respond in an anticipatory manner and adopting a no regrets approach.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Leonard, can we have your views, please?
Dominic, I think we can actually use the global network to do some work on anticipatory action. And yes, international partnerships do a lot of anticipatory action. The Neighborhood and Development and International Cooperation Instrument has a lot of interventions. What we did together with ECHO on desert locusts is what I call a nexus team approach between ECHO and INTPA on anticipatory action. The work we do on ARC, the work we do on the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, and the work we do in terms of research and innovation around agroecology, around land and land rights, the work we do on regreening Africa, the work that we will be doing with the French and with a number of member states around the Great Green Wall. All this is clearly in DG instruments with also colleagues from ECHO, but we need better coordination. What Emily said, I think, is key, and also what Brian and Ryan said. We need to get the data analytics right, but also we need to get the structures that the global network is trying to do between national, regional, and global, and triggering better coordination on the ground. The Team Europe approach that the European Union is trying to construe in our programming is not only the Commission services, but also our member states. And I think with the Rome-based agencies, with this, it's not a question just of the compendium, but what is working best with the resources we have. Because yes, we often ourselves in our constituency speak about finance, lack of finance, we need more finance. I think what we need to do is smarter finance, targeting return on investment of what we can do smarter. Resources might not be getting any better in the future. There is so much competition out there. I don't need to say it, but clearly a smarter approach in terms of tools, instruments, using and unleashing the full potential of digital and innovative applications, geospatial data, to really look into issues around water, around conflict, around pastoralism. And the global network, Dominic, can be an entry point, at least one of the entry points. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Leonard and Andrea. Let me now move to Pete and Rain, actually. And we have a question in the Q&A for Bangladesh, and on whether the database of vulnerable households linked to the government social security registry, social registry under the National Social Protection System. But I would like, of course, to generalize this to ask, can we link anticipatory action to social protection? Is this important, and why? So who wants to go first? Pete?
Okay, let me try to reply to this. So the database that we've set up, we have consulted a number of the existing social safety nets and see whether these households were indeed meeting the criteria that the 5 partner agencies have come up with. But yes, to go to the larger question, definitely we'd like to see how anticipatory action can be used as an element in making social protection more adaptive, more shock responsive. We are developing some concepts on that. We are trying out some small pilots on that. Well, let's talk again in 1 or 2 years and see how it works. But definitely, this is one way to link social protection, which has mechanisms to reach people, to use those to also then quickly respond to any shock that comes their way. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Pete. Rain?
Dominic, thank you. So, I mean, maybe then on this broader question, yes, indeed. I mean, linking social protection to anticipatory action is key. Maybe actually, if we reframe it a little bit, this question around how we can actually make social protection mechanisms themselves more anticipatory is clearly an important priority. Certainly for FAO, one of our priorities when we look at our anticipatory action scale-up plans in the next few years. And I think it's so important to do it. And I think the question is very welcome, because all of these comments we've been hearing today and the discussion has pointed to, the need, the imperative to make sure that anticipatory action is not simply viewed as something that should sit fully within the remit of humanitarian action and limited to humanitarian tools and humanitarian financing. Coming back to this systems comment that was made before, I think it's indispensable that we move beyond it. So, making social protection mechanisms more anticipatory, I think, is at the heart of what we're trying to do. And I think, allows us to have also wider conversations then around the extent to which protection from shocks features more prominently, is embedded more into the heart of social policies of government and other ones. I know we're out of time, but just to say, we've had reference, including importantly from Commissioner Lenarchic today, to this partnership program that FAO has with ECHO, and we see this as a vital pioneering initiative to help work precisely on these type of links. We're starting this year in Asia and then hopefully in other regions too. But thank you very much for the question, Dominic. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Reine. And I will now move to Mr. Thomas and Ms. Montier. And if you could please tell us what are the current key barriers to scaling locally led anticipatory action to address food crises. Ms. Montier, you want to go first?
Key barriers to scaling locally led. I think the most important thing is that the structures, I think, that we are setting up are being set up in a way that is inclusive of the needs and priorities of these local actors. I think, as mentioned before in my intervention, often there's an assumption that if we start to involve local actors, that things will necessarily get very fragmented and small scale. And this is not necessarily the case. There are ways to connect together locally led initiatives, as mentioned, as we've been trying to do at Start Network, by supporting the establishment of locally led networks so that can actually drive these systems themselves. There are also ways to ensure that macro level schemes, for example, government level schemes, actually integrate the priorities and needs of local actors. So as I mentioned earlier with this example of Senegal, we're going through the process at the moment of working with the government of Senegal to actually decentralize the national level contingency planning to province level and start to integrate much more the inputs of different communities and local responders into that process. So there's ways to involve local national responders and have their priorities at the center of this, whilst also ensuring that we can continue to scale and connect to larger macro level schemes. So yeah, that's from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. And let me now move to Mr. Thomas. Mr. Thomas, please.
Thank you so much for that, Dominic. I think, from our perspective, the barriers are sort of built around, if you want, two main issues. One is the one that the ECHO already mentioned, is the ethical dilemma between the acute and the anticipatory. How do you overcome that sort of humanitarian imperative for acute, but knowing that anticipatory would probably be better and more efficient and more effective, but yet try and find that balance both from a decision-making perspective, but also from a systems perspective in trying to change your investments and your financing, right? So I think that's the bigger one, sort of at the top of the level. The other barrier I think we see is, and I think your colleague from FAO already mentioned this, the issue around social protection systems. I think the social protection systems were not built, for using, now readily available risk information in packageable form and ready to be understood form in some sense. And I think the adaptation of social protection systems and the interventions to this risk-based model, I think would be a key to reduce that barrier, especially for food security purposes, because in many cases we know that protection of livelihoods and cash as an instrument, and now using technology in particular to distribute cash, So the earlier barriers that we had for delivery are not there. The barriers that we have now are the social, at a policy level, to try and make it more trigger based and more easily identifiable so they can be implemented.
Thank you very much, Bhupinder, for your comments. And finally, let me move to Mr. Jama. Abdi, you refer to the situation in the desert locust situation in the IGAD region. Could you tell us what anticipatory measures has IGAD put in place to mitigate future impacts of desert locust on the food security and nutrition situation of communities in the region? Very briefly, please, 1 minute.
Thank you, Dominic. I think the anticipatory action that IGAD did was mostly trying to get political build-up of advocacy for the desert locust issues. I think the convening the ministers every once in a while and being and not only the ministers in these ministers, we also brought all the humanitarian agencies also in this meeting. Bringing the partners together was already making sure that the issue of desert locust is here with us, and the countries need to be prepared for it. And in cases where there's a shortfall in one of the countries, we used to provide press releases and press conferences to make sure that that country is resourced adequately. That's mostly the funding part was the difficult part, but also we looked at the more of the longer, in medium term sort of things. Focus on the humanitarian food crisis, but more to say to an extent that we now have a forum we are establishing with the World Bank for desert locusts and transboundary issues.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Abdi, and I would like to really thank all our excellent speakers today. I think it has been indeed very rich and stimulating exchange on what is critical today and one that requires our collective and urgent effort. And I will try not to, due to time constraint, to summarize in very briefly the key takeaways, bearing in mind that we will share with you all the longest version as soon as possible. So first of all, we are seeing clear evidence that hunger and humanitarian needs are on the rise. It is proving increasingly difficult to keep up with these rapidly growing needs. At the same time, shocks to food system and food security are today to a great degree predictable, and anticipating food crisis is an obtainable goal, one which we need to collectively pursue. We must commit to scaling up anticipatory action to reach more people, cover more geographic area, and apply it to a wider range of hazards and contexts. However, we are still on a learning curve, and this came out from many interventions today. It is crucial to gain more and more diverse practical experience through scaled up anticipatory programming, build collective evidence, and systematically disseminate information. Stepping up anticipatory action for food crises required boldness and innovation. For this, we need to overcome operational inertias that favor well-established practices and take determined political action. Anticipatory action can play a key role in building resilient agri-food system, one of the key global goals articulated by the UN Food System Summit. As such, it is the responsibility of all actors, including development and peace actors. We must also strengthen and invest in early warning and food security information system. We need to ensure more predictably, flexibly, and ensure availability of funding for anticipatory action. Finally, we must also ensure sustainability of anticipatory action through ownership and capacity building at country and at local level. So these are just a few of the key takeaways. There are more. We'll be sharing with you the more detailed version of these takeaways. So now we have reached the end of this event. And ladies and gentlemen, I would say it has been a very rich and inspiring event. And we thank you very much for taking part. And thank you again to all our excellent speakers. The richness of the dialogue illustrates the importance of the dialogue and the importance of the topic of anticipatory action as a key contribution to ending hunger and achieving the SDG and SDG 2 in particular. With that, I would like to thank you all and wish you a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dominique.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Dominique. Bye-bye.
Thanks, all.
Thank you, Dominique. Bye.
Thank you, Dominique, and yep. Good one.
Thank you, Dominique.